I was not his bride. I was his punishment. The morning I became the Duchess of Ravensworth, there were no flowers in the chapel, no music swelling through the vaulted ceilings, no guests bearing witness to the union. There was only the cold grey light of February pressing through the stained glass, the vicar's trembling voice reciting vows that felt like sentences, and the man beside me, whose hatred I could feel radiating from his body like heat from a fire I was forbidden to approach. Edward Blackwood, the 6th Duke of Ravensworth, did not look at me as he spoke the words that would bind us together. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set in stone, his dark eyes fixed on the altar as though he were making a deal with something far more ancient than matrimony. And when it came time for him to place the ring upon my finger, his touch was brief and cold, a transaction completed, a debt collected. I had agreed to this. That is what I told myself as we walked out of the chapel and into the bitter wind that swept across the grounds of Ravensworth Hall. I had agreed because there was nothing else left for me, because the name I carried had become a curse, and because the alternative was a life of slow disappearance in governess positions that grew fewer each year as my reputation preceded me. Eleanor Ashford, the daughter of the man who destroyed the Blackwood fortune, the daughter of the man who, they whispered, drove the Dowager Duchess to her grave. I had heard the accusations so many times that they had become a sort of dark hymn, sung in every household where I sought employment, in every drawing room where ladies paused their conversations as I entered. I did not know if the accusations were true. My father had died when I was 17, alone and broken. His final letter to me, containing only 3 words. Forgive me, Eleanor. I never knew for what I was meant to forgive him, and now I never would. The Duke had found me in Hertfordshire, where I served as governess to a family of modest means who had not yet heard the full extent of my disgrace. I remember the afternoon he arrived, his carriage dark and gleaming like a hearse, his presence filling the small parlor where I had been summoned by the mistress of the house. He stood by the window, tall and impossibly still, and when he turned to face me, I understood immediately that this was not a social call. His eyes moved over me with the detached precision of a man examining an object he intended to purchase, and when he spoke, his voice was low and smooth and utterly without warmth. "You are Eleanor Ashford," he said. It was not a question. "I am," I replied, and I remember how my voice did not waver, though my hands had begun to tremble beneath the folds of my skirt. He told me then what he intended. A marriage, a union that would serve as the final act of his revenge against my father's memory. I would live in his house as his wife in name only, stripped of status, stripped of dignity, a living reminder of the justice he believed himself owed. He did not soften the terms or dress them in the language of courtesy. He laid them before me like a contract, and then he waited. I should have refused. Any woman with pride, with self-respect, with even the faintest hope of happiness, would have refused. But as I stood there in that cramped parlor, with the winter light dying behind him and the silence pressing against my ears, I realized that pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. I had spent 10 years running from my father's shadow, and it had followed me to every door, every threshold, every narrow bed in every cold room where I had lain awake, wondering what I had done to deserve such a fate. Perhaps, I thought, if I walked into the fire willingly, it would finally stop chasing me. Perhaps if I gave the Duke his revenge, I could finally stop paying for sins I did not commit. And so I said yes. The carriage ride to Ravensworth Hall took 3 days, and in all that time, the Duke spoke to me only once. It was the second evening, at an inn where we had stopped for the night. I was seated in the small private dining room, my food untouched before me, when he entered without announcement and stood across the table, his gaze settling on me with an intensity that made the candlelight seem to flicker. "You should know," he said, "that I do not intend to make your life comfortable. You will have a room, you will have clothing appropriate to your station as my wife, and you will appear beside me when society requires it. But do not mistake proximity for affection. I did not bring you here to love you, Miss Ashford. I brought you here to watch you understand what it means to lose everything." He left before I could respond, and I sat there for a long time after, watching the candle burn down to a pool of wax. I thought of my mother, who had died when I was 12, her face already fading in my memory like a portrait left too long in the sun. I thought of my father, his hands shaking as he signed papers I did not understand, his eyes hollow in the weeks before he died. And I thought of the woman I had been before all of this, the girl who had believed in love and goodness and the possibility of a life unmarked by sorrow. That girl felt very far away now. Perhaps she had never existed at all. Ravensworth Hall rose from the mist like a creature from a dream I could not quite remember. It was vast and ancient, its stone walls darkened by centuries of rain and wind, its windows watching my approach like eyes that had seen too much and judged too harshly. The grounds stretched endlessly in every direction, gardens that had once been beautiful, now overgrown and wild, as though the estate itself had fallen into mourning and could not find its way back to the living. When the carriage stopped before the great front doors, I felt something tighten in my chest, a premonition perhaps, or simply the weight of understanding that this was to be my prison, and I had walked into it with my eyes open. The servants greeted me with silence, not the respectful silence of deference, but the heavy silence of suspicion, of loyalty to a master who had made clear that I was not to be welcomed. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Brennan, whose face seemed carved from the same gray stone as the house itself, led me through corridors that echoed with my footsteps and deposited me in a room on the east wing, far from the master's chambers, far from the warmth of the central fireplaces, far from anything that might have suggested I belonged. "This is your room, madam," she said, and the word madam fell from her lips like an accusation. "The Duke has instructed that your meals will be taken here unless you are required for formal occasions. Is there anything else you need?" I looked around the room, at the narrow bed with its faded coverlet, at the single window that overlooked a courtyard where weeds grew between the stones, at the fireplace where a meager fire struggled against the cold. This was to be my world, this small, forgotten corner of a house that did not want me. "No," I said. "Thank you." She left without another word, and I stood there in the silence, my trunk at my feet, my future stretching before me like a road through fog. I did not cry. I had learned long ago that tears were a luxury, that grief required witnesses to be meaningful, and I had none. Instead, I unpacked my few belongings, hung my dresses in the wardrobe that smelled of dust and disuse, and sat on the edge of the bed as the last light faded from the sky. That first night, I dreamed of my father. He was standing in his study, the study where I used to sit and read while he worked, and he was trying to tell me something, his lips moving urgently, his hands reaching toward me. But no sound came from his mouth, and no matter how close I walked toward him, he remained always just beyond my reach. I woke with the taste of sorrow on my tongue and the certain knowledge that I was utterly alone. The days that followed blurred into one another, indistinguishable in their emptiness. I learned the rhythms of the house, the hours when the servants moved through the corridors, and the hours when the silence became absolute. I learned that the Duke kept largely to the west wing, where his study and private chambers were located, and that our paths crossed only on the occasions when he required my presence for some social obligation or another. At those times, he would send word through Mrs. Brennan, and I would dress in one of the gowns that had been provided for me, gowns that were elegant but cold, chosen without regard for my taste or comfort, and I would descend to the drawing room to stand beside a husband who looked through me as though I were made of glass. The neighbors came to call, of course. News of the Duke's marriage had spread quickly, and society was curious about the woman he had chosen, the woman whose father's name still hung in the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished. I received them in the formal parlor, Mrs. Brennan hovering nearby like a sentinel, and I answered their questions with the careful vagueness I had perfected over years of navigating hostile territory. Yes, I was honored to be the Duchess. No, I had not known the Duke before our engagement. Yes, the house was beautiful. No, I could not say when we might hold a proper reception. They left with their curiosity unsatisfied and their suspicions intact, and I returned to my room in the east wing, where the fire had burned down to embers and the chill had crept back into the walls. It was in the 3rd week of my marriage that I discovered the library. I had been wandering the corridors late one afternoon, driven from my room by a restlessness I could not name, when I came upon a door I had not noticed before. It was smaller than the others, tucked into an alcove at the end of a hallway that seemed to lead nowhere, and when I turned the handle, it gave way easily, as though it had been waiting for me. The room beyond was dark, the heavy curtains drawn against the fading light, but I could make out the shapes of bookshelves lining the walls, reaching up toward a ceiling I could not see. The air smelled of paper and dust and something else, something floral and faint, like the ghost of a perfume. I found a candle on a table near the door and lit it with matches I had taken to carrying in my pocket, and as the flame grew, the room revealed itself to me. It was not large, not like the grand library on the 1st floor where the Duke conducted his business, but it was beautiful in its intimacy, its shelves filled with volumes that seemed chosen for love rather than display. There was a settee near the window, its fabric faded but still soft, and a writing desk in the corner, its surface covered with papers that had yellowed with age. And on the mantelpiece, a portrait of a woman I did not recognize. She was beautiful, with dark hair swept back from a face that seemed both gentle and sad, and eyes that looked out from the canvas with an expression I could not quite decipher. She wore a gown of deep blue, and at her throat was a locket that caught the light of my candle and seemed almost to glow. I stood before her for a long time, this unknown woman, and I felt something stir in my chest, a recognition I could not explain, as though she were someone I had known in another life and forgotten. It was Mrs. Brennan who told me when I asked the next morning, her voice flat and her eyes carefully averted. "That is the late Duchess, madam, the Duke's mother, Lady Margaret Blackwood. That was her private library, though no one has used it since her death. The Duke does not go there." I nodded, and I did not ask anything more. But that evening, I returned to the library, and I sat on the settee beneath Lady Margaret's portrait, and I read by candlelight until the moon rose high outside the window. I did not know why this room called to me so strongly, why the presence of this woman I had never known felt like a comfort in a house that offered me none. I only knew that here, among her books and her silence, I felt less alone. And it was here, 3 days later, that I found the drawer. It was hidden in the writing desk, a small compartment that clicked open when I pressed the carved rose at the edge of the frame. Inside, wrapped in velvet that had once been green, was a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with handwriting that slanted gracefully across the paper. I held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling the weight of it, knowing that I should not read it, that it was not mine to read. But something compelled me, some instinct that whispered this was meant for me, that Lady Margaret herself had left it here for a reason I could not yet understand. I opened to the first page, and I read the words written there in faded ink. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the truth has been buried with me. But truth, like love, does not stay buried forever. It finds its way to the light. It finds its way to those who need it most." The candle flickered, and somewhere in the house, a door closed. I clutched the journal to my chest, my heart beating wildly, and I knew that everything was about to change. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the library until the candle burned to nothing, and the first pale light of dawn crept beneath the curtains, and I read the words of a woman who had been dead for 10 years, but whose voice seemed to rise from the pages as though she were sitting beside me, whispering her secrets into my ear. Lady Margaret Blackwood had begun her journal in the spring of 1842, the year before her death. The entries were irregular, sometimes separated by weeks, sometimes written in quick succession, as though she could not stop the flow of words once they began. She wrote of her life at Ravensworth Hall, of the loneliness that had settled over her since her husband's death 5 years prior, of her son Edward, who had grown distant and cold in his grief. But woven through these ordinary observations was something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat each time I encountered it. She wrote of a secret she had carried for nearly 3 decades, a secret that had shaped the course of her life and the lives of those she loved. "I cannot continue like this," she wrote in an entry dated June of that year. "The weight of what I have done presses upon me with each passing day, and I fear that if I do not set it down somewhere, it will consume me entirely. Edward does not know. He cannot know. And yet I look at him, and I see his father's eyes, and I wonder if he would hate me as his father did, in those final years, when he learned what I had kept from him." I turned the pages with trembling hands, searching for more, but the entries that followed spoke of other things, of household matters and social obligations, of the declining health that would eventually claim her life. It was not until I reached the middle of the journal that I found what I was looking for, an entry written in a hand that shook with emotion, the ink blotted in places as though tears had fallen upon the paper. I must write it now. I must write it before my courage fails me again. "Before I married Lord Blackwood, before I became the Duchess of Ravensworth, I was Margaret Sinclair, the daughter of a country gentleman with more pride than fortune. I was young and foolish and desperately in love with a man my family would never have accepted. His name was James, and he was the son of our steward, educated beyond his station through the kindness of a benefactor destined for a life that could never include a woman like me. We met in secret in the gardens behind my father's house, and we spoke of the future as though it belonged to us, as though love alone could conquer the walls that society had built between us. I was 18 when I discovered I was carrying his child. The words blurred before my eyes, and I had to stop, had to press my hand against my chest to steady the wild beating of my heart. A child. Lady Margaret had borne a child out of wedlock, a child whose existence had been hidden, whose father had been a man deemed unsuitable by the rigid standards of her world. I thought of the portrait above me, of those sad and gentle eyes, and I understood now what I had seen in them. Not just sorrow, but guilt. The guilt of a woman who had given up something precious to preserve her place in a world that offered no mercy to those who strayed from its rules. I read on, desperate now to know more. My father discovered the truth before I could find a way to tell him. He was furious, not at me, but at the situation, at the scandal that would destroy our family if it became known. James was sent away, I never learned where, and I was confined to my room while arrangements were made. My father had a friend, a man named Thomas Ashford, who had recently married a woman who could not bear children. They agreed to take the baby when it came, to raise it as their own, and in exchange, my father would provide them with a sum that would secure their future. It was a transaction, clean and efficient, and when it was done, I was expected to forget that any of it had ever happened. I gave birth to a daughter in the autumn of 1815, in a cottage on the edge of my father's estate where no one would see, where no one would know. I held her for 1 hour before they took her from me. She had dark hair, like mine, and when she opened her eyes, they were the color of the sea after a storm. I named her Eleanor, though I knew the Ashfords would call her something else, would give her a life that had no room for the woman who had brought her into the world. The journal fell from my hands. Eleanor. I sat there in the gray light of morning, unable to move, unable to think, as the pieces of my life rearranged themselves into a pattern I had never imagined. Thomas Ashford was not my father. The man who had raised me, who had loved me, who had died alone and broken while I wept in a room miles away, was not my father. And the woman whose portrait hung above me, whose sadness I had recognized without knowing why, whose library had called to me from the first moment I stepped inside. She was my mother, my true mother. The Dowager Duchess of Ravensworth, whose death I had been blamed for, whose memory had been used to justify the revenge that had brought me to this house. I do not know how long I sat there. Time lost its meaning, became a thing I moved through without awareness, like water or fog. At some point, I became aware of footsteps in the corridor outside, of voices calling my name, of Mrs. Brennan's sharp knock upon the door. I did not answer. I could not have spoken if my life had depended on it. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, and I was alone again with the journal and the truth it contained. I made myself read the rest. I owed her that much, this woman who had given me life and then given me away, who had watched from a distance as I grew into someone she could never claim. The entries that followed traced the years of her silence, her marriage to Lord Blackwood, the birth of her son Edward, the careful construction of a life that looked from the outside like everything a woman of her position should want. But beneath the surface, there was always the wound that would not heal, the daughter she had lost, the love she had surrendered to the demands of a world that valued reputation above all else. "I have watched her from afar," she wrote in an entry dated several years later. "The Ashfords brought her to London for the season, though they could ill afford it, and I saw her at a ball, standing near the window in a gown that was not quite fashionable, her eyes taking in everything with a quiet intensity that reminded me so much of James that I nearly wept. She is beautiful, she is strong, and she does not know that I exist, that somewhere in this crowded room there is a woman whose heart is breaking at the sight of her." There were more entries, scattered over the years, each one a fragment of grief, a stolen glimpse of a life that was mine. She had followed my progress through society's whispers, had learned of my father's financial troubles, had tried once to send money anonymously to ease his burden. But the money had been returned, and she had understood that Thomas Ashford, whatever his faults, was a proud man who would not accept charity from strangers. She had watched as my prospects dimmed, as the name Ashford became synonymous with disgrace, and she had been powerless to help. And then, in the final entries, written in the months before her death, there was something else. "I have learned what my son has done. Edward has convinced himself that Thomas Ashford is responsible for our family's misfortune, that the investments that failed were sabotaged, that the man who raised my daughter is a villain who deserves punishment. He does not know the truth. He does not know that Thomas acted only to protect me, that the financial records he believes prove treachery were fabricated by men who sought to profit from our family's confusion after my husband's death. I have tried to tell him, but he will not listen. He is consumed by a rage that frightens me, a need for vengeance that has twisted the boy I loved into someone I barely recognize. I fear for Eleanor. I fear that Edward's hatred will find her, will harm her in ways I cannot prevent. And so I am writing this, hiding it, where only someone who seeks the truth will find it, hoping that one day, when I am gone and the weight of secrets no longer presses upon me, the right person will discover what I could not bring myself to say aloud. Eleanor is my daughter. She is not Thomas Ashford's child by blood, though he loved her as his own. She is mine. And if Edward ever learns this, if he ever reads these words, I beg him to understand. I beg him to see that the woman he blames for our family's suffering is innocent. She is more than innocent. She is his sister in spirit, if not in blood, the daughter of the mother he claims to have loved above all others. Protect her, Edward. For my sake, if for no other reason. Protect her, and let the past finally rest. The journal ended there. The remaining pages were blank, waiting for words that would never come. Lady Margaret had died before she could add more, and her secrets had been buried with her, hidden in a drawer that no one had thought to open, waiting for the daughter she had lost to find them. I closed the journal and pressed it against my heart, and for the first time since I had arrived at Ravensworth Hall, I allowed myself to weep. The tears came in waves, each one carrying with it a different grief. I wept for my mother, the mother I had never known, who had loved me from a distance and died with my name unspoken on her lips. I wept for Thomas Ashford, the man who had raised me as his own, who had sacrificed everything to keep a secret that was not his to keep. I wept for myself, for the years I had spent wondering why I was cursed, why my name brought suspicion and my presence brought whispers, when all along the truth had been something so different, so unexpected, that I could never have imagined it. And I wept for Edward, the man who had married me for revenge, who had brought me to this house to punish me for sins I did not commit, did not know that I was the daughter his mother had begged him to protect. He did not know that his hatred was built on lies, that the vengeance he craved was a poison that had already destroyed more than he could comprehend. He was not my brother. The journal had made that clear. Margaret had conceived me before her marriage to Lord Blackwood, before Edward's father had ever entered her life, but I was connected to him nonetheless, bound by the love of a woman who had given us both life in different ways, who had watched us both from the shadows of her secret and prayed that one day we would find our way to each other. What was I to do with this knowledge? I could go to him. I could show him the journal, force him to read his mother's words, and watch as his certainty crumbled into dust. But even as I imagined it, I knew that I was not ready. The wounds he had inflicted were still fresh, the humiliation still burning in my memory. I needed time to understand what this truth meant, how it changed the shape of my life and the nature of my imprisonment. And I needed to decide if Edward Blackwood deserved to know the truth at all, or if his cruelty had forfeited any claim he might have had to his mother's final wishes. I hid the journal beneath my mattress, where no one would think to look, and I washed my face in the cold water from the basin by my window. The day was beginning in earnest now, the sounds of the household rising around me, and I knew that I would have to face it as I had faced every day since my arrival. With composure, with silence, with the careful blankness of a woman who had learned that survival required the surrender of everything that made her visible. But something had changed. I could feel it in my bones, in the way I held my shoulders as I dressed, in the steadiness of my hands as I pinned my hair. I was no longer just Eleanor Ashford, the disgraced daughter of a ruined man, the unwilling wife of a vengeful duke. I was Eleanor, daughter of Margaret, child of a love that had defied the world and lost. And that knowledge, however painful, however complicated, was a kind of armor I had not possessed before. I would need it in the days to come. That evening, for the first time since our wedding, the Duke summoned me to dine with him. Mrs. Brennan delivered the message with her usual coldness, and I received it with a calmness that seemed to surprise her. I dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep green that had been among the finest provided to me, and I descended to the dining room with the journal's words echoing in my mind. Protect her, Edward, for my sake, if for no other reason. He was already seated when I arrived, his dark hair catching the candlelight, his face as unreadable as ever. He did not rise when I entered, did not acknowledge my presence until I had taken my place at the far end of the long table, separated from him by an expanse of polished wood and silver that felt like a chasm. "I trust you are settling in," he said, and there was something in his voice that I had not heard before, a weariness that softened the edges of his customary coldness. "I am," I replied. "The library has been a comfort." His eyes flickered at that, a brief flash of something that might have been surprise or suspicion or something else entirely. "My mother's library," he said. "I'm surprised you found it. Few people know it exists." "I found it by accident," I said, and the lie came easily, as lies do when they are necessary. "It is a beautiful room. Your mother had excellent taste in books." He was silent for a long moment, and I watched him across the candlelit distance, searching his face for some sign of the boy his mother had described, the son she had loved, even as she despaired of reaching him. He looked older than his years, I realized, older and more tired, as though the weight of his hatred had worn grooves into his soul that could never be smoothed away. "She did," he said finally. "She was fond of reading. It was one of the few things that gave her pleasure in the end. I wanted to ask him about her. I wanted to know what he remembered, what he had loved, whether he had ever sensed the secret she had carried for so long. But I held my tongue. The time for such questions would come, but it was not now. Now I needed only to watch and to listen, to learn the shape of his grief so that I might understand how to reach him when the moment arrived." The dinner passed in near silence, but it was a different silence than before. There was something tentative in it, something almost curious, as though he too was watching me across the table, searching for answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. When I returned to my room that night, I took out the journal and held it in my hands, feeling the weight of all the words it contained, all the love and sorrow and desperate hope that Lady Margaret had poured into its pages. "I will find a way," I whispered to her portrait in my mind. "I will find a way to make him understand." But even as I spoke the words, I knew that the path ahead would be long and treacherous, and that the truth, once revealed, might destroy more than it healed. The weeks that followed were a study in contradictions. On the surface, nothing had changed. I was still the unwanted wife, still confined to my corner of the east wing, still regarded by the servants with the same mixture of pity and suspicion that had greeted me upon my arrival. But beneath the surface, everything was different. I moved through Ravensworth Hall with new eyes, seeing not just the cold grandeur of its rooms, but the echoes of the woman who had once walked these same corridors, who had loved these same books, who had looked out these same windows and thought of the daughter she could never claim. I returned to the library often, sometimes twice a day, drawn by a force I could not name. I sat in the chair where Margaret must have sat, ran my fingers over the spines of the books she had chosen, and tried to imagine the life she had lived within these walls. Had she been happy here, I wondered? Had Lord Blackwood known of her secret? Or had she carried it alone through all the years of their marriage, smiling at dinners and balls while her heart ached for the child she had surrendered? The journal offered glimpses but not answers, fragments of feeling that only deepened the mystery of who she had been. And then there was Edward. Since that first dinner, he had summoned me to join him at the table nearly every evening. The invitations came through Mrs. Brennan, as always, but there was something different in the way she delivered them now, a slight hesitation in her voice that suggested even she did not understand what was happening. We sat at opposite ends of the long table, separated by silver and candlelight, and we spoke of small things, careful things, the weather and the estate and the business of managing a household that had grown accustomed to solitude. He did not apologize for the way he had treated me. He did not soften his manner or offer kindnesses that might have suggested a change of heart. But he was present in a way he had not been before, his attention focused, his questions probing gently at the edges of my silence. I found myself watching him when I thought he would not notice, searching for traces of Margaret in his features. His eyes were darker than hers, his jaw more severe. But there was something in the way he held himself, a tension that spoke of emotions held too tightly for too long, that reminded me of her words in the journal. "He is consumed by a rage that frightens me," she had written, "a need for vengeance that has twisted the boy I loved into someone I barely recognize." I saw that rage still, flickering beneath the surface of his composure, but I saw something else too. A weariness, a loneliness that mirrored my own. It was a dangerous thing, this watching. I knew that I could not afford to feel sympathy for the man who had made me his prisoner, who had married me as an act of cruelty and kept me in his house as a trophy of his revenge. But the more I learned about his mother, the more I understood that Edward was as much a victim of the past as I was. He had been lied to, manipulated, led to believe that my father was responsible for the destruction of his family, when in truth, the blame lay elsewhere. With men whose names Margaret had not known, whose motives she could only guess at. His hatred was real, but it was built on a foundation of deception, and I could not help but wonder what he might become if that foundation were ever to crumble. One evening, near the end of my second month at Ravensworth, he asked me something that caught me off guard. We had finished our meal and were sitting in the silence that had become customary between us, the candles burning low, the fire crackling in the grate. I was about to excuse myself when he spoke, his voice quieter than usual, almost tentative. "Why did you agree to marry me?" I looked at him across the table, surprised by the question and uncertain how to answer. He had never asked me this before. He had assumed, I think, that my acceptance was simply a matter of desperation, of having no other choice, and perhaps it had been. But there was more to it than that, layers of feeling I had not fully understood until this moment. "I had nothing left," I said finally. "My father's name was a curse. Every door that might have been opened to me was closed. When you offered marriage, however cruel the terms, it was still a kind of ending, a way to stop running from something I could never escape." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "And now?" he asked. "Do you regret it?" I thought of the journal hidden beneath my mattress, of the truth I carried like a stone in my chest. I thought of Margaret, who had given me away to protect me, who had watched me from a distance and prayed for my happiness. And I thought of Edward, who had brought me here to suffer, who did not know that the woman he punished was the one his mother had loved most in all the world. "I do not know," I said honestly. "I do not yet know what I have agreed to." Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been confusion or respect or the first faint stirring of doubt. He did not respond, and after a moment I rose and left the room, feeling his gaze follow me as I disappeared into the corridor. That night, I dreamed of Margaret again. She was standing in the library, the candlelight casting soft shadows on her face, and she was smiling at me with an expression of such tenderness that I woke with tears on my cheeks. The dream faded quickly, as dreams do, but the feeling it left behind remained, a warmth that seemed to settle into my bones and stay there. The next morning brought an unexpected interruption to the quiet rhythm of my days. I was in the library, as had become my habit, when Mrs. Brennan appeared at the door with an expression that suggested something unusual was afoot. "There is a visitor, madam," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "A Mrs. Thornton. She claims to be a friend of your late mother and says she has traveled a great distance to see you." My heart stopped. My late mother. She meant the woman I had believed to be my mother, the wife of Thomas Ashford, who had died when I was 12. I had no memory of a Mrs. Thornton, no recollection of any friend by that name. But something in the mention of her made my pulse quicken. A premonition, perhaps, or simply the instinct that had served me well through years of navigating uncertain territory. "Please show her to the drawing room," I said. "I will be there shortly." Mrs. Brennan nodded and withdrew, and I took a moment to compose myself before following. I did not know what to expect from this visitor, but I knew that in a house full of secrets, even the smallest disruption could carry significance I could not yet imagine. The woman waiting for me in the drawing room was old, older than I had expected, her hair white beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, her face lined with the kind of wrinkles that spoke of years spent in worry rather than laughter. She rose when I entered, her eyes fixing on me with an intensity that was almost unsettling, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other, two strangers connected by threads neither of us fully understood. "Mrs. Thornton," I said, offering my hand, "I am afraid I do not recall your name. My mother passed when I was quite young." She took my hand, and her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers cool and dry against my skin. "You would not remember me," she said. "I was only in your household for a short time when you were very small. But I remember you, Miss Ashford. I have thought of you often over the years. I gestured for her to sit, and I took the chair across from her, my mind racing with questions I did not know how to ask. You said you were a friend of my mother's, I began, but she shook her head. Not a friend, she said. A nurse. I was engaged to care for you when you were first brought to the Ashford home. I was there when you arrived, a baby of only a few weeks, and I was there when Mrs. Ashford took you into her arms and wept with joy at the sight of you. My breath caught. A nurse. Someone who had been present at the very beginning, who might know things that even the journal had not revealed. I do not understand, I said carefully. Why have you come now, after all these years? She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw in her eyes a struggle, a weighing of choices that had clearly cost her much. I read of your marriage in the papers, she said finally. The Duke of Ravensworth and the daughter of Thomas Ashford. I knew then that I could not stay silent any longer. There are things you deserve to know, things that were hidden from you for reasons that seemed right at the time, but that I have come to believe were wrong. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. When she unwrapped it, I saw a locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful, its surface engraved with a pattern of roses that seemed somehow familiar. This belonged to your true mother, she said, placing it in my hands. She gave it to me on the day she surrendered you, and she made me promise to keep it safe until the time came when you could know the truth. I have carried it with me for 30 years, waiting for the right moment. When I read of your marriage, I knew the moment had come. I opened the locket with trembling fingers, and inside I found 2 miniature portraits. One was of Margaret, younger than in the painting that hung in the library, her face unlined by the sorrow that would come to define her later years. The other was of a man I did not recognize, handsome and dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to hold both joy and sadness in equal measure. That is James, Mrs. Thornton said softly. Your father. He died many years ago, in a distant country, never knowing what had become of you. Your mother loved him until the day she died, though she could never speak his name aloud. I stared at the portraits, at these 2 faces that had given me life, and I felt the world shift around me once again. The journal had told me of James, but only in fragments, in the carefully guarded words of a woman who had learned to hide her deepest feelings, even from herself. Now, holding this locket, I felt their presence as something real, something tangible, a connection to a past I was only beginning to understand. Did she ever try to find me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. After I was grown, did she ever try to reach me? Mrs. Thornton's face softened with compassion. She watched you from afar, she said. She knew where you were, always. But she was bound by promises, by the arrangements that had been made to protect both you and her. The Ashfords loved you as their own, and she believed that to reveal the truth would only cause pain. She thought she was protecting you. I closed the locket and held it against my heart, feeling the cool metal warm against my skin. And now? I asked. Why tell me now when she is gone and cannot speak for herself? Mrs. Thornton leaned forward, her old eyes bright with urgency. Because you are in the house of her son, she said. Because the Duke does not know who you truly are, and I fear what his ignorance may cost you both. Lady Margaret came to me before she died, when she was already weak and fading. She told me of the journal she had hidden, of the truth she had written down for you to find. She made me promise that if the time ever came when you needed protection, I would come forward and speak. That time has come, Miss Ashford. The Duke's hatred is built on lies, and only the truth can set you both free. I sat in silence, the weight of her words pressing down upon me. She did not know that I had already found the journal, that I already knew the secret she had come to reveal. But her presence here, her willingness to break decades of silence, told me something important. The truth wanted to be known. It was pushing against the walls that had contained it for so long, seeking a way into the light. Will you tell him? Mrs. Thornton asked. Will you show him his mother's words? I looked at the locket in my hands, at the faces of the parents I had never known, and I thought of Edward, alone in his wing of the house, nursing a hatred that had poisoned his life as surely as it had poisoned mine. I do not know, I said. I do not yet know if he deserves to know. Mrs. Thornton nodded slowly, as though she had expected this answer. That is your choice to make, she said. But remember, the truth is not a weapon. It is a gift, however painful. And sometimes the ones who least deserve mercy are the ones who need it most. She left that afternoon, disappearing back into the world from which she had come, and I stood at the window of my room and watched her carriage grow small against the winter sky. In my hand, I held the locket. In my heart, I held a question that had no easy answer. That evening, when the summons came for dinner, I descended the stairs with the locket hidden beneath my dress, its weight resting against my skin like a secret waiting to be told. Edward was already at the table, and when he looked up at my entrance, something in his expression made me pause. He seemed troubled, his brow furrowed, his hands restless against the stem of his glass. You had a visitor today, he said, and it was not a question. I did, I replied, taking my seat. An old woman who knew my family many years ago. What did she want? I met his gaze across the candlelit distance, and I felt the locket burning against my chest like a brand. She came to tell me about my mother, I said, the one I never knew. His eyes flickered with something I could not read, and for a moment I thought he would press further. But instead he looked away, his jaw tightening, and the silence that fell between us was heavier than any that had come before. The truth was drawing closer. I could feel it circling us both, patient and inevitable, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be denied. The storm came without warning, as storms often do in that part of the country, rolling in from the moors like a living thing, dark and furious and hungry for destruction. I had been in the library when the first crack of thunder split the sky, and I stayed there as the rain began, watching through the window as the gardens disappeared behind sheets of water and the old trees bent beneath the wind like supplicants before an angry God. I do not know what made me go to him that night. Perhaps it was the storm itself, the way it made the house feel smaller, more intimate, as though the walls were drawing close around us and there was nowhere left to hide. Perhaps it was Mrs. Thornton's words, still echoing in my mind after 3 days of silence. The ones who least deserve mercy are the ones who need it most. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of the secret I carried, grown too heavy at last to bear alone. I found Edward in his study, a room I had never entered before, its door standing half open as though he had forgotten to close it. He was sitting before the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. He did not look up when I entered, and I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching him, wondering if he knew I was there, wondering if it mattered. You should not be wandering the house in a storm, he said finally, his voice rough. The east wing is prone to leaks. I stepped into the room and closed the door behind me. I could not sleep, I said. The thunder keeps me awake. He glanced at me then, a brief flicker of attention that seemed to take in everything about me. The shawl wrapped around my shoulders, the way my hair had begun to slip from its pins, the shadows beneath my eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. Sit, he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. If you must be awake, you may as well be warm. I sat, and for a time we did not speak. The fire crackled between us, and outside the wind howled against the windows, and I felt a strange peace settle over me. The peace of surrender, of knowing that whatever came next, I had done what I could to prepare for it. It was Edward who broke the silence. I have been thinking, he said slowly, about what you told me, about your visitor, the woman who knew your family. I waited, my heart beating faster, though I kept my face still. She said she came to tell you about your mother, he continued. The one you never knew. What did she mean by that? Your mother died when you were 12. You knew her. I took a breath, and I felt the locket pressing against my skin beneath my dress, a reminder of the truth I had carried for so long. The woman who raised me was not my mother by blood, I said. I discovered this recently. My true mother was someone else, someone I never met. Edward's eyes sharpened, and I saw the calculation behind them. The mind that was always working, always searching for advantage or threat. Who? He asked. I could have told him then. I could have pulled out the locket, handed him his mother's journal, and watched as his world collapsed around him. But something held me back. Some instinct that whispered it was not yet time. That there was more he needed to understand before the truth could do its work. I do not wish to speak of it tonight, I said. It is a painful subject, and I am tired. He studied me for a long moment, and I saw frustration flicker across his face, quickly suppressed. You are keeping something from me, he said. I can see it in your eyes. You have been different since that woman came. I met his gaze steadily. We all keep things from each other, I said. It is the nature of this arrangement you forced upon me. You did not marry me for honesty. You married me for revenge. The word hung in the air between us, sharp and unavoidable. I saw him flinch, the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but I caught it nonetheless. Is that what you believe? He asked quietly. That everything I have done was out of cruelty? I thought of the cold mornings in my narrow room, the meals taken alone, the whispers of servants who regarded me as an intruder. I thought of the wedding without flowers, the vows spoken like sentences, the ring placed upon my finger by hands that seemed to recoil from the touch. What else am I to believe? I asked. You told me yourself, on the night before our wedding. You did not bring me here to love me. You brought me here to watch me suffer. He looked away, into the fire, and I saw something in his profile that I had not seen before. Regret, perhaps, or shame. The emotions of a man who had begun to question the path he had chosen, but did not know how to turn back. I was angry, he said finally. I had been angry for so long that I did not know how to be anything else. When my mother died, I believed it was your father's fault. I believed he had destroyed her, and I wanted someone to pay for that destruction. You were the only one left. And now? I asked, echoing the question he had once asked me. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Now I do not know what I believe. The storm raged on outside, but in that room, something had shifted. I could feel it in the air between us, a softening, a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. He was not the monster I had believed him to be. He was a man in pain, a man who had built his life around a wound that had never healed. And for the first time since I had come to Ravensworth Hall, I felt something other than fear or anger when I looked at him. I felt pity, and beneath the pity, something else, something I was not yet ready to name. I rose from my chair, and he looked up at me, his eyes dark and uncertain. When you are ready to hear the truth, I said, I will tell you, but not tonight. Tonight, we are both too tired for revelations. I left him there, sitting before the dying fire, and I returned to my room in the east wing with the storm still howling outside my window. I did not sleep, but I was no longer afraid of the sleeplessness. Something had changed between us, and I knew that the change was only beginning. The days that followed were different from any that had come before. Edward no longer confined himself to the west wing, no longer avoided me as though my presence were a contagion. He appeared in the library one afternoon while I was reading, and he sat across from me without explanation, selecting a book from the shelf and settling into a silence that felt almost companionable. He joined me for walks in the garden when the weather permitted, pointing out the roses his mother had planted, the paths she had loved to wander in the evenings. He spoke of her often now, as though some barrier had broken and the memories could finally flow free. "She used to read to me here," he said one day, standing in the doorway of the library. "When I was young, before my father died. She would sit in that chair by the window, and I would lie on the floor at her feet, and she would read for hours, stories of knights and dragons and lands far away. I had forgotten that until recently. I had forgotten how happy we were. I listened, and I watched, and I felt the truth pressing against my lips like a living thing desperate to escape. But still I held back. I was waiting, I realized, for him to be ready. For the walls he had built to come down far enough that the truth would not destroy him but transform him. It was on a Thursday afternoon, nearly a week after the storm, that everything changed. I had gone to the library as usual, but when I arrived, I found the door standing open and Edward inside, standing before his mother's portrait with an expression I had never seen on his face. In his hands, he held the journal. My blood turned to ice. I must have made a sound because he turned, and when his eyes met mine, I saw that he knew. He had found it. He had read it. And the world I had been so carefully preparing was now crashing down around us both. "You knew," he said, and his voice was hollow, emptied of everything except the raw edge of shock. "You knew, and you did not tell me." I stepped into the room, my legs unsteady beneath me. "I was waiting," I said. "I was waiting for the right moment." "The right moment," he repeated, and there was something bitter in the way he spoke the words. "The right moment to tell me that everything I believed was a lie. The right moment to tell me that my mother had a daughter I never knew existed? That the woman I married to punish is the one she loved most in all the world?" He threw the journal onto the desk, and the sound of it striking the wood was like a gunshot in the silent room. "I have spent 10 years hating your father," he said, his voice rising. 10 years believing he was responsible for my mother's death, for the destruction of everything she held dear. And now I learn that he was innocent, that he raised you as his own to protect her secret, that the men I trusted, the advisors who guided me after my father's death, were the ones who fed me lies and profited from my ignorance. He turned away from me, his hands bracing against the desk, his shoulders shaking with the force of emotions he could not contain. "I have done terrible things," he said, his voice breaking. "I have hurt people who did not deserve it. I have built my life on hatred, and now I discover that the hatred was built on nothing, on lies and manipulation and the cruelty of men who saw my grief as an opportunity." I moved toward him slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "You did not know," I said softly. "You were young, and you were in pain, and you believed what you were told. The fault lies with those who deceived you, not with yourself." He turned to face me, and I saw that there were tears on his cheeks, tears he did not try to hide. "How can you say that?" he demanded. "After everything I have done to you. I forced you into a marriage you did not want. I brought you to this house to humiliate you. I treated you as an enemy when you were the one person my mother wanted me to protect. How can you stand there and offer me absolution when I deserve nothing but contempt?" I reached up, and before I knew what I was doing, I touched his face, my fingers brushing against the wetness of his tears. "Because I have read her words," I said. "I have felt her love, not just for me, but for you. She wrote of you with such tenderness, such hope. She believed that beneath your anger there was still the boy she had raised, the son she had loved. She believed you could find your way back to kindness if only someone showed you the way." He closed his eyes, and I felt him lean into my touch, just slightly, as though he were starving for comfort and could not help himself. "I do not deserve your forgiveness," he whispered. "Perhaps not," I said. "But forgiveness is not about deserving. It is about choosing to let go of the pain, to make room for something new. Your mother understood that. She forgave herself for the choices she made, even though they cost her everything. She forgave my father for the sacrifices he made on her behalf, and she would want us to forgive each other, to find a way forward that honors her memory, instead of destroying ourselves with the weight of the past." He opened his eyes, and for the first time, I saw him clearly. Not the cold duke who had married me for revenge, not the grieving son consumed by hatred, just a man, broken and searching, reaching for something he was not sure he could hold. "Eleanor," he said, and my name on his lips sounded like a prayer. I did not answer. I simply stood there, my hand still resting against his face, and I let the silence speak for us both. That night, we did not dine at opposite ends of the long table. We sat together, close enough to touch, and we talked until the candles burned low and the fire faded to embers. He told me of his childhood, of the father who had been stern but loving, of the mother who had filled the house with music and laughter before grief dimmed her light. I told him of my own childhood, of Thomas Ashford's quiet devotion, of the mother I had believed was mine, who had died too young and left me with nothing but questions. We did not speak of love. It was too soon for that, too fragile, too uncertain. But something had begun between us, something that felt like the first green shoots of spring pushing through the frozen ground. We had both been prisoners of the past, chained by secrets and lies and the weight of other people's choices. Now, for the first time, we had a chance to choose for ourselves. When I finally retired to my room, I found that my feet carried me not to the east wing, but to a door I had never opened, a door in the west wing that led to a chamber I had never seen, Edward's chamber. I stood outside it for a long moment, my heart pounding, and then I turned and walked away. Not yet, I told myself, but soon. The future stretched before me, no longer a prison, but a possibility. And for the first time since I had become the Duchess of Ravensworth, I allowed myself to hope. Spring came to Ravensworth Hall like a whispered apology, soft and tentative, as though the land itself was uncertain whether it had permission to bloom. I watched the transformation from the window of my new room in the west wing, a room Edward had insisted I take, with its view of the gardens his mother had planted and its walls lined with silk the color of morning sky. The roses were beginning to bud, their green shoots reaching toward a sun that grew warmer with each passing day, and I thought of Margaret often as I watched them, wondering if she had stood at this same window, looking out at this same view, dreaming of the daughter she would never hold. 3 months had passed since the night Edward found the journal. 3 months of slow and careful rebuilding, of conversations that stretched into the small hours of the morning, of silences that no longer felt like punishment, but like peace. He had dismissed the advisors who had fed him lies, men whose names I learned to hate as I understood the full extent of their manipulation. He had written letters to families his revenge had harmed, offering restitution where it was possible and apology where it was not. And he had begun, piece by piece, to dismantle the fortress of anger he had built around his heart. I watched this transformation with wonder and with fear. Wonder because I had not believed such change was possible, had not believed that a man so consumed by hatred could find his way back to tenderness. Fear because with each passing day I felt my own walls crumbling, felt myself falling into something I had sworn I would never allow myself to feel. Love. The word terrified me. It had brought my mother nothing but sorrow, had driven her to surrender the child she cherished to protect herself from scandal. It had destroyed my father, the man who had raised me, whose devotion to Margaret's secret had cost him everything. And yet here I was, standing at the edge of something vast and uncertain, knowing that if I fell, I might never find my way back. It was Edward who spoke first. We were in the library, Margaret's library, which had become our sanctuary in those months of healing. The portrait of my mother looked down upon us as it always did, her eyes soft with the sadness I now understood, her smile holding secrets I had finally learned to read. Edward was sitting beside me on the settee, closer than he had ever sat before, his shoulder almost touching mine, and I was acutely aware of his presence, of the warmth that radiated from him, like heat from a hearth. "I have been thinking," he said, and his voice was low, almost hesitant, as though the words he was about to speak had cost him something to prepare, about what happens next, about what kind of marriage this will be now that everything has changed. I turned to look at him, and I saw in his face an uncertainty that mirrored my own. "And what have you concluded?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew something small, something that caught the light and glimmered like a promise. It was a ring, not the cold band he had placed upon my finger at our wedding, but something different, something beautiful. A sapphire, deep blue and perfect, set in gold that had been worked into the shape of roses. "This was my mother's," he said. "She wore it on her right hand, always. I found it among her things after she died, and I kept it, though I did not know why. Now I understand. She was keeping it for you." He took my hand gently, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "Eleanor," he said, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made the room seem to shrink around us. "I married you in anger. I brought you to this house intending to cause you pain. I cannot undo what I have done, cannot erase the suffering I inflicted in the name of a revenge that was never justified. But I can offer you something now, something I should have offered from the beginning. I can offer you my heart. Wholly and without reservation. Not because my mother asked me to protect you, but because in these months of knowing you, truly knowing you, I have discovered that you are everything I never knew I needed. You are kind when you have every reason to be cruel. You are strong when lesser souls would have broken. You have forgiven me when forgiveness was more than I deserved. And I love you, Eleanor. I love you with everything I am and everything I hope to become." The tears came before I could stop them, spilling down my cheeks like the spring rain that had begun to fall outside the window. I had waited so long to hear those words, had dreamed of them in the darkness of my narrow room in the East Wing, had told myself they would never come, that I was foolish to hope for something so impossible. And now here they were, spoken aloud, offered like a gift I had not earned but desperately wanted. "I do not know what to say," I whispered. He smiled, and it was a smile I had never seen on his face before, open and unguarded and filled with a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I do not ask for an answer now. I only ask that you allow me to prove myself worthy of you. Allow me to court you as I should have from the beginning. Allow me to show you, day by day, that my love is more than words." I looked at the ring in his hand, at the sapphire that seemed to hold all the depth of the sky within its facets, and I thought of Margaret, who had loved so fiercely and lost so much, who had spent her life longing for a happiness she believed was beyond her reach. "She would have wanted this," I said softly. "She would have wanted us to find each other." He nodded, and I saw the grief that still lived in his eyes, the sorrow for the mother he had not understood until it was too late. "I believe she did," he said. "I believe everything she did, every choice she made, was leading us to this moment. She could not give you the life she wanted for you, but she could give you this house, this family, this future. She could give you me." He slipped the ring onto my finger, beside the cold band that had symbolized our union of hatred, and the contrast between them was stark and beautiful. One a reminder of where we had begun, the other a promise of where we might go. "I love you," I said, and the words felt like freedom, like the first breath after years of drowning. "I love you, Edward. Not because of who your mother was, or who my father was, or any of the tangled history that brought us together. I love you because you are the man who held my hand in the darkness, who wept for the wrongs he had committed, who chose to become better even when it cost him everything he thought he knew. I love you because you are kind beneath the coldness, gentle beneath the grief, and because when I look into your eyes, I see a future I want to live." He kissed me then, for the first time, and it was nothing like I had imagined a kiss would be. It was not the fierce collision of passion I had read about in novels. It was soft and slow and full of reverence, as though he were afraid I might break or vanish, or prove to be a dream he had conjured in his loneliness. I kissed him back, and in that moment, all the pain of the past fell away, and there was only this, only us, only the quiet miracle of two broken people finding wholeness in each other's arms. The months that followed were the happiest of my life. Edward announced our reconciliation to society with a ball held in the Grand Hall of Ravensworth, the first such event the house had seen in over a decade. The neighbors came in droves, curious and suspicious and hungry for gossip. But what they found was not the cold Duke and his unwilling bride. What they found was a couple who danced together as though the music had been written for them alone, who looked at each other with an affection that could not be feigned, who moved through the glittering crowd as partners in every sense of the word. The whispers about my father faded, replaced by new whispers about the Duke's transformation, about the love match that had bloomed from such unpromising soil. I did not care what they said. I had spent too many years living in fear of society's judgment, and I had learned at last that the only opinions that mattered were those of the people I loved. We visited Margaret's grave on a morning in early May, when the roses in the garden had burst into full bloom and the air was thick with their perfume. Edward had ordered a new headstone, one that bore not just her name and dates, but an inscription I had helped him choose. "Beloved Mother," it read. "Your truth set us free." I knelt before the grave and placed a bouquet of roses upon the earth, and I spoke to her as I had longed to speak to her all my life. "I found your journal," I said softly. "I read your words. I know now what you sacrificed for me, what it cost you to let me go. I cannot thank you for the years we lost, but I can thank you for the years you have given me, for this house, this man, this second chance at happiness. I will honor your memory, Mother. I will live the life you dreamed for me, and I will tell your grandchildren about you so that they will know the woman whose love made everything possible." Edward stood beside me, his hand in mine, and when I rose, I saw that his eyes were wet with tears he did not try to hide. "She would be proud of you," he said. "She would be so proud." I leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around me, and we stood there together in the golden morning light, two people who had been lost and had found each other at last. Our first child was born the following spring, a daughter with dark hair like mine and her father's deep brown eyes. We named her Margaret, and when I held her for the first time, I felt the circle close around us, the past and the present joining hands across the years. My mother had given me away to protect me, had watched me from a distance and prayed for my happiness. Now I held her granddaughter in my arms, and I knew that her prayers had been answered in ways she could never have imagined. Edward was transformed by fatherhood in ways that still surprised me. The cold and distant Duke had become a man who wept at his daughter's first smile, who walked the floors at night when she could not sleep, who looked at me across the breakfast table with an expression of such profound gratitude that it stole my breath. We had both been changed by love, shaped by it, made into people we had not believed we could become. On the first anniversary of Margaret's birth, we held a small ceremony in the library, just the three of us, and Mrs. Thornton, who had become a regular visitor to Ravensworth in the years since her first appearance, and the portrait of my mother watching over us all. Edward read aloud from the journal, passages I had chosen, words that spoke of love and loss, and the fierce hope that had sustained Margaret through all the years of her silence. And when he finished, I placed the locket around our daughter's neck, the locket that held the portraits of my parents, the parents I had never known, but whose love had given me life. "This is your legacy," I told her, though she was too young to understand. "This is the story of how you came to be. You are the child of secrets and sacrifices, of love that endured across decades and distance. You are the proof that even the darkest beginnings can lead to the brightest endings. And no matter what happens, no matter where life takes you, you will always have this house, this family, this love that surrounds you. She reached up with her small hand and grasped the locket, and I felt tears slide down my cheeks, tears of joy rather than sorrow, tears for all that had been lost and all that had been found. Edward put his arm around me, and I leaned into his warmth, and together we looked at the portrait of my mother, at her sad and gentle eyes that seemed, in the golden light of afternoon, to hold something like peace at last. "We did it," I whispered to her. "We found our way home." The portrait did not answer, of course. Portraits never do. But I like to believe that somewhere, in whatever place the dead go when they leave us, Margaret Blackwood was smiling. Her secret had been kept for 30 years, buried beneath layers of duty and fear, and the rigid expectations of a world that allowed no room for human frailty. But the truth, as she had written, does not stay buried forever. It finds its way to the light. It finds its way to those who need it most. And in finding me, it had healed us all. I am Eleanor Blackwood now, Duchess of Ravensworth, mother to Margaret and 2 sons who came after her, wife to a man who loves me with a devotion that still, after all these years, takes my breath away. The house that was once my prison has become my home, its corridors filled with laughter and music and the sound of children's feet running across the ancient floors. The gardens bloom with roses every spring, and I tend them myself sometimes, kneeling in the earth my mother once walked, feeling her presence in the warmth of the sun and the sweetness of the breeze. I have forgiven the past, all of it. The men who lied to Edward, who profited from his grief and twisted him into an instrument of their greed. The society that judged me for a name I did not choose, that closed its doors against me when I had done nothing wrong. Even myself, for the years I spent believing I was cursed, that I deserved the suffering that had befallen me. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not about forgetting. It is about choosing to carry the weight differently, to transform the burden of pain into something that strengthens rather than destroys. And I have learned to love without fear, to give myself wholly to the people who matter, to trust that the joy we share is not a trick, not a temporary reprieve before the next disaster. Life will bring sorrows, I know. It always does. But it will also bring mornings like this one, when I wake beside my husband and watch the light creep across his sleeping face, when I hear my children stirring in the nursery down the hall, when I feel the fullness of a life lived with purpose and passion and the kind of deep, abiding love that my mother dreamed of but never dared to claim. This is her legacy. This is her gift, and I will spend the rest of my days being worthy of it. The story that began with revenge ends with redemption. The marriage that was meant to be my punishment has become my greatest blessing. And the Duke who married me to watch me suffer now looks at me as though I am the sun around which his entire world revolves. Some love stories begin with a glance across a crowded ballroom. Ours began with hatred, with secrets, with the weight of generations of sorrow pressing down upon us both. But in the end, it does not matter how a love story begins. What matters is how it continues. What matters is the choice we make, again and again, to reach for each other across the darkness, to hold on even when letting go would be easier, to believe that the human heart is capable of transformation, of forgiveness, of a grace that transcends the cruelties of circumstance. I believe in that grace now. I have seen it work its miracles in my own life, in my husband's eyes, in the laughter of my children. And every evening, when the sun sets over Ravensworth Hall and the shadows lengthen across the gardens my mother planted, I whisper a prayer of gratitude to the woman who gave me life twice, once in body and once in truth. Thank you, I tell her. Thank you for the journal. Thank you for the locket. Thank you for the courage to write down what you could not say aloud. And thank you, most of all, for believing that one day your daughter would find her way home.